has just announced that one of the 6 countries which will allow adoptions from is Taiwan.
Oh, right.
Which is really interesting.
Why?
All the more interesting that Hague, I mean, they can't be a part of the Hague, but they do try to, apparently they do try to follow the rules, but I'm not convinced about that, but I was amazed. And Hans, as you saw, Hans, I knew that already, but he noted that. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think they developed certain criteria for accepting countries.
I think they're literally just...
And apparently, but are there children from Taiwan adopted?
I know, they went and got Argos chairs, but they haven't got some out.
Well, it's like the United States.
Yeah.
No, it's really quite
I honestly don't know. They've all got stars on them, but that doesn't mean anything. Literally just says stars, doesn't have their name on it.
now, or when
I think it is like they've all got mics, so they must just be running them. But
Yeah.
I don't know, but I've been really watching the interpreters of sign. They're really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And they've got another board here as well because which is really good. Yeah. Do you need anything else? Got a coffee? Give me one from the brew. Whatever the point is. Yeah, I'll go get you.
Yeah, they have. If you get that, we've got one. Yeah. I forgot all about that. I will post it. Okay.
各位与会贵宾午安，我们稍后会议预计在2分钟后开始，请各位贵宾我们可以入座，谢谢。
sugar on it?
Ah, yeah. You got the wine.
Carried away. I was writing up my draft.
Do you need anything? Anyone?
Anybody wants anything? No?
Draft the conclusion motivation.
Yeah. Sure.
And
You.
how is it going?
Oh, good. I'm following your template. It's nice. I like the way you word it. I'm following. I've just done discrimination.
Yeah.
And I started
Like.
Yeah. So that's fine. So, yeah. I'd like to have it done today. I won't have education until tomorrow.
2022儿童权利公约第2次国家报。
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the review meeting. In the afternoon, we're going to cover Chapter 5 to Chapter 7. Again, we will start with a round of questions and then please give a round of responses. When you want to speak up, please raise your hand so our staff can give you the mic. And please turn on the mic, wait for 3 minutes, and then the mic will start working. Throughout the session, interpreting will be provided. In order for interpreters to hear you clearly, please pay attention to your pace. Thank you very much. Again, the deputy and head of the delegation, Deputy Tsai from MOJ, and Minister Wang Yiling, Minister without portfolio, will help with the meeting. Now, Chair, you have the floor.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. This afternoon, as already was announced, we will deal with the 5, 6, and 7 clusters, but we will start with answers to the question that were raised by Dr. Cantwell this morning on identity, and particularly the issue of donor received and surrogate. So the floor is for the government.
来，请内政部先回。
Ministry of Interior. Regarding the 2 questions asked in the morning session, I would like to provide some response. First, on stateless children. First of all, for non-Taiwanese children, well, it doesn't mean that they're always stateless, because if their parents have foreign nationality, of course, they assume the foreign nationalities. For stateless children, then in practice, local governments may provide care for them. Since it's difficult to identify their status, they will ask MOI to help looking for their biological parents. And if they cannot be found, then such children will be considered to be stateless. And if the stateless children are adopted by Taiwanese nationals, they will be naturalized. If they are not adopted, then they are cared by the social welfare organizations. These organizations will help the children to be naturalized. That's the first part of my response. Second, on children born by surrogates. The Household Department of MOI help with the registration, depending on the legal relations of people and on fact, and finish the registration. And nationality and household registration are 2 different concepts. First of all, if one of the parents is a Taiwanese national, then this child has Taiwanese nationality. With nationality, then this child can have household registration. If a child is born in Taiwan, he or she can be registered. If Taiwanese nationals give birth in foreign country, then we don't call this birth registration. We call this household registration. So after this child enters Taiwan, they have to receive the permit to reside in Taiwan and then finish the household registration. So if Taiwanese nationals go to a foreign country and have a child through surrogates, but surrogacy is not legalized in Taiwan. However, it happens overseas. And if the foreign court give the identity of this child and confirming that this Taiwanese national is the father or the mother of this child, and then the court order is issued or the court verdict is issued, this verdict can be used in Taiwanese court to apply for residence in Taiwan with the residence, and then the children can get the registration. Without the foreign court verdict, then the parents can provide another document provided by the administrative agency overseas, and we can also use it to register this child. So is it possible that there's illegal surrogacy in Taiwan? Well, I think that is one of the case. If children are born in a hospital, the hospital will issue birth certificates, which identifies the mother, and the household department will use that certificate to register the child. Okay, so is there any extra information from the Ministry of Health and Welfare? Okay, National Health Administration. This is National Health Administration. Depending on the Artificial Reproductive Act, surrogacy is not legalized. The law, this act, is still being amended. So it is on the list for amendments and more discussions. Of course, it related to the identification of the surrogates and family relations, how to create the family relations, how are the relations different from a natural birth. So the act is still being discussed, and an amendment is pending. Okay, anything from Ministry of Justice? This is MOJ. We work with National Health Administration, and we help provide some legal opinions, but we respect a National Health Administration, and we respect national policy. So we help with the legal proceedings. That's all. Thank you. Thank you all. These are the responses from government.
Yeah, for the clarifications. So just to be sure that we are understanding each other, in terms of children who are found to be stateless, obviously not every child of a foreigner is stateless, but for a child who is found to be stateless and is in the care of the local government, the Ministry of Interior will help to ensure that the documentation is, it will help. It's not may help, but will help. So that's a really important point. In terms of surrogacy, there will be admittedly different procedures according to how the surrogate child arrives in Taiwan. Is the surrogate child brought into Taiwan by the intending parents, or is there some other means by which the child arrives? Was the child registered in the country of birth, etc., etc.? There are different conditions, but the important thing that we need to understand is that that child will be the beneficiary of all the rights in the convention without discrimination because of his or her circumstances of birth.
am I correct in thinking that there will be no discrimination against the child who is born through surrogacy? Yeah. It's really vital to know that, particularly, as I said before, in a country where surrogacy is not legal. And as I said, that's not a problem. But the potential problem is always the status of a child born of surrogacy in a country where surrogacy is not legal. I also asked about the question of donor-conceived children and their access to information on their origins, and if I don't think that I received a response to that. What is it? The kinship? No, not kinship. Kinsfolk relation record is only made available in case of marriage or adoption, is what I understand, and I'm wondering if you have comments on that, because again, it's an extraordinarily important and very different from surrogacy, but nonetheless important, particularly at this time when donor-conceived children are becoming more and more numerous and are concerned about access to information on their origins, not conditional on their becoming married or being adopted or adopting another child. So if you can give a response on the access to information of donor-conceived children, that would be extremely useful. Thank you.
MOI, would you please confirm it? Okay, on the first part, yeah. Yes, indeed. I would like to respond to the first part. Yes, local government and MOI will help stateless children to get or to be naturalized. Second, on surrogacy, it is not part of our responsibilities, but in practice, when anyone who wants to get household information, there should be some involved interest. So it's not really depending on surrogacy or not. The kinfolk relations and relevant information is made available when there is an interest involved.
Let me become very concrete. There is a couple of Taiwanese citizens. They want to have a child. They go to, for instance, Thailand. They have contracted a woman there to give birth to a child. What particularly the biological aspect is, you can talk about it, but that's the fact. The child is born, they go to the court in Thailand. The assumption is that it is acceptable under Thai law or another country. So they are there and they go through court or through the birth registration office, and they are there acknowledged as the parents of that child, born from a mother, surrogate is the name, but that woman has provided the service that she was contracted for. Now the parents arrive in Taiwan and they want to register the child as their child in your birth registration and household registration. And the question is that possible, or is there a law that prohibits that registration?
We got the question. Thank you. So in that particular case, because the court has acknowledged the biological mother to be the person, not Taiwanese national. So with that birth certificate in Taiwan, you cannot register the child to be a child of two Taiwanese nationals. But if in a foreign court, the court acknowledges the two Taiwanese nationals as the child's parents, then we here can acknowledge in the same way. But if the foreign court acknowledges the surrogate mother as the mother of the child, then we cannot change that in that certificate.
So it is important, but assuming, well, most countries have a rule that the mother of a child is the woman who gave birth to the child. But it is possible, and it may be, let's assume that it is in that foreign country done by way of adoption. So the child has been adopted by the two Taiwanese, and you have a court order that confirms that particular adoption. I assume that those parents then can register the child here in Taipei in the birth registration and the household registration. Okay.
Yes, if the adoption has been completed in a foreign country, we do acknowledge this relationship.
I'm going to punish my microphone at the end of the day. Thank you very much for all the answers, and very clear also. The next cluster or chapter is all are important, but this is very rather, let's say, difficult. It's on violence against children, and violence against children, as you know, happens in many forms and in many places and in all countries in the world. So the assumption that a country doesn't have violence against children is clearly not true. And the floor is for Dr. Vukovic to start with questions on the information that we received from the government on violence against children. Nevena.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All over again. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for all clarifications that we got so far. It is a very interesting dialogue, and we learn a lot, and hope we can contribute to at least with our concluding observations, but also with this dialogue in which we as you can see, we freely express our opinion on different things. So to make the long story short, it is true, violence is actually one of the new clusters. It didn't exist before because we only had abuse and neglect, and then there were specific forms of violence. So it is very overarching, and you will see when we discuss, and probably you already noticed when you wrote the state report and the replies to the list of issues, that actually you had to go left and right. And even now, among ourselves, we've had this discussion to which extent I should go in asking questions here, because many issues that are related to violence are related to different settings. So my colleague Laura Lundy and John Tobin, Laura will talk about violence in education system, and Jaap will talk about violence in family, and John will tackle violence in health system, and certainly violence against children with disabilities. So it is broad, and I'm going to stick just to some basic issues, and there will be more talk about it. Why do we insist on that? Because we've heard so much about violence from children and from NGOs, and we tend to believe that we know that it is not the major problem in the country, but we tend to believe that at least when it comes to children, it is somehow very high on their list of priorities, their list of rights that are most endangered. And it's not the case only in this country. Whenever I remember, whenever we talk to children from different countries, they're always afraid of violence. Particularly in some countries, girls are very much afraid of violence. So with that, I will go directly to what you wrote in your list of issues, and you explained many things that we raised in the list of issues. For example, it was not very clear to us how are abuse and neglect defined in national legislation and in those interpretative documents that went along with the legislation. So all we can say is, okay, congratulations, you have very good definitions, but I would still suggest that you try and incorporate fully definitions that we have in the convention, like, for example, in the general comment number 8, which is on corporal punishment. And also in the UN study on violence, there is a very good definition of violence against children. And the interesting thing is that it speaks about all settings. So school, community, education system, state care. Did I miss something? Family, yes, family. So and workplace, because many children work before they are 18. So it's happening everywhere. So as for abuse and neglect, it is basically what happens in families and in alternative care for children. So yes, we are happy with this definition. At least I'm happy. Maybe my colleagues will have to add more. But I would really like to see more clear definition in the law rather than in interpretative documents. Also, noting all the efforts that the government has put into prevention of violence in all those settings, there is some concern about violence in non-formal education. We haven't heard a lot about that. Something from children, you know, about sports clubs or I don't know, even children's playrooms and different types of different types of non-formal settings. So how is the current definition that you have, how does it apply? And also the inspection system. How do you cope with the informal systems of education? How do you find out? Do you wait till some violence is reported, or you simply go and inspect all non-formal systems? It's also very important that you continue with the good work on investing in training and education of teachers, social workers, and professionals. But as we talked this morning, we would still encourage you to tell us more about, or to initiate maybe more research and discussions on the root causes of violence, and particularly, as I mentioned earlier, this ratio between the current cases, those that are reported, and those cases that we believe are never reported. Because we also heard from children, for example, when there is violence in schools, that that many of them are reluctant to report due to the fact that they may be somehow their identity may be revealed. But Laura will talk more about that. We are also very happy that the government, and that what we read and know, that you have undertaken legislative and practical activities to address sexual violence in all settings, including in digital environment. We heard about that a lot today, and it's really commendable. But we noticed that even in your statistics, that there is actually increase of sexual abuse of children in schools and placement institutions. So all these measures are in place, definitions, the laws, and everything is in place, and still it is on the rise. How do we understand that? Is it, again, due to the fact that perpetrators are still roaming around, roaming freely, because no one reports them? I mean, what is your knowledge about that? What is your thinking about that? Is impunity for sexual offense against children widespread or not? In many countries it is, unfortunately. I will just move briefly to two issues, and one is the protection of children, victims and witnesses of crime. This is where actually our optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution and child pornography is very, very valuable, because unlike the convention, it speaks a lot about protection of victims and witnesses of violence. And the committee really insists on the protection of those children, because somehow we've been preoccupied with children who were in conflict with the law for many decades, building systems for them so that they can have fair trial and fair treatment and alternatives. But I think that children who are victims and witnesses in particular have been neglected in many countries. Now we have international standards, and I see that you have established this very elaborate cooperation mechanism, and I'm going to read the title: Severe Child Abuse Case Judicial Early Intervention Tripartite Collaboration Procedure. That procedure looks very impressive when you look at the chart. So my question is, how has it been implemented? Because it has to be implemented not only on the central level, but also on the regional level. And so how is the coordination functioning there? Is it in its infant stages? So we are yet to see the results. And actually that system is aimed at making sure that children who are victims and witnesses are always protected in special way. And talking about this special protection, and I think that it was mentioned this morning, the initiatives to establish special way of interviewing children, like when Professor Duke said that when he was a judge, he would go home to see children, but that was probably not part of the system. That was because he is a nice person. But now in many countries we have what is called children's houses, and this is physically a house, a special place where a child who is a victim or a witness can go and can be examined by a medical profession and psychologists, can be interviewed by prosecutors, by the police, and even talk to judge. And the child possibly can go to that place, only one place, maybe once or twice, and then the things are done. So it's being established in so many countries now. And if you know about that model, would you consider something like that? Because it's much better for the child than to go to a courtroom, to be interviewed several times, to meet face to face with perpetrator. So that's something which is very important, and that will really encourage children to report cases when they know they are safe. When they report a case, they don't go through these terrible steps. You know, police, hospital, court, prosecutor, seeing your perpetrator. That's terrible. Okay, and finally, my last concern and clarification I need is with regards to recovery and reintegration. In your replies to the list of issues, you actually explained that there is a legal and practical framework for integration and recovery of child victims of witnesses. Part of the recovery process, I think that the recovery starts already in the children's house. If there is a child house, that's already part of the recovery. But if it doesn't exist, what is it that practically, apart from what is written here, or what measures are you undertaking, and how do you measure results? Since you establish special safeguards for children who have been victims and witnesses, and you want them to go to reintegrate into society without any traumas, what is it that you are doing, and have you tried to measure results? And can you look 5 years back and 10 years back and say, okay, we've rehabilitated so many children who have been exposed to grave forms of sexual violence or any other, it could be trafficking, labor violence and other stuff. And finally, we talked a lot about complaints mechanisms, and here there is also one specific question, and it is on hotlines. And we read here that there is a hotline in the country, and that hotline there is a number, but the report, at least the translation that we have here, speaks in future times, uses like future. The hotline will distribute the cases, will do this, will do that. So does it exist? Has it been used? Or it's something that has been introduced and you're expecting results? And I think that you also mentioned some other system, or maybe that's the same hotline, but it's not clear here, that services are provided about 45,000 times in average. In average, in which period and what happens to them, and just if someone can tell us something about that. So that would be all. I thank you very much for your attention.
She's finished. Violence in school.
Oh, no, I did tomorrow.
Okay. More specific on violence against children. Dr. Vukovic already referred to the various settings, and you are aware, and it's reflected in the report, that violence happens in various situations, in schools, in institutions, and also at home. I very much appreciate your decision to delete from the law the article that allows parents to inflict punishment on their children. So deleting that particular line from the law doesn't mean that violence in the home doesn't take place anymore. On the contrary, the law has a limited impact on this particular problem. But it is good to set a standard by telling parents that they are not having the right to inflict punishment on the children. The question in that regard is, when it is in the home, you have the physical, the mental, and the sexual violence against the child. They are all under most of the criminal laws in the world. Assault against a person is an offense. And that particular article, that's a matter of discussion, whether that also includes mental violence and whether that's an offense as well. But certainly sexual violence. The traditional response to this kind of situations is that the child is placed in a safe place temporarily. Unfortunately, some of them are ending in those institutions for the rest of their young life. But nevertheless, it is a traditional answer. You also consider the possibility and have the possibility, I think, but perhaps you could clarify a little bit more, the removal of the perpetrator. The assumption under that particular rule is that you know who the perpetrator is and that you have enough information to make it understandable why you assume that he has or she has committed that particular act of violence. The question that arises when it comes to particularly sexual violence, a lot of children who have that experience at home don't report. They sometimes try to make that known to a teacher in school, but if that teacher is not trained in identifying signals of children, possibly a victim of violence, then the child doesn't get the support or response that she or he is hoping for. The question that arises in that regard, and I didn't find it in your report, that is the matter of statute of limitation. Some of the children finally do report, make known that they were the victims, but at the time the prosecutor cannot prosecute anymore because statute of limitation tells that she or he should have done that 5 years earlier. So the question is, are you considering to change the statute of limitation for this particular form of violence, and perhaps also for the other forms of violence that have similar statute of limitations, to allow that the possibility that the perpetrator is brought to justice ultimately? So that is the one. The other is about mandatory reporting. You will find in General Comment number 13 that the committee recommends all states parties to introduce mandatory reporting of cases of violence by those who, as professionals, work with or for children. So all the people who are in professional capacity working with children, for children, and they find out, or they are told by the child, that the child has been a victim of violence. It doesn't matter which kind of violence. Is there a mandatory reporting provision in the law? Is that applicable for public at large and everybody else? Or is that only for the professionals? And if that is the case, then one of the next questions in this particular practice is, and to whom, to what are you going to report? And what is then a lot of other questions. But let me limit the question to that particular aspect of dealing with violence at home, because we know that a prohibition, because you did delete the possibility to use physical violence in the correction and disciplining of children at home, I didn't find a line that says for parents it's prohibited to use any kind of violence, whatever it is, and that includes corporal punishment. I'm not going to tell you the story about the reactions when in the press you try to tell that parents should not be allowed to corporally punish their children. You get a wide variety of interesting reactions to that particular proposal. But I'd like to know whether you are, in your law, considering the possibility of including prohibition of use of violence in the upbringing of children by parents or others. I think that's for the very sensitive part of the violence problem, and that is when it happens at home. I think that's, for now, the questions, and we are supposed to have a break at 3 o'clock. That's correct? Okay. Yeah, I did discover it. I didn't decide it, but I did discover in the program that there was a break between 3 and 3:20. So you have 50 minutes to start with answering the question, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you. The Department of Protective Affairs, and then we can talk about the statutes of limitation too. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. On the forms of violence in different settings. Exactly. In Taiwan, according to our Child and Youth Act, Article 49 says that no one, in whatever settings, be it family, schools, or institutions, anyone in any setting shall not engage in the following behaviors and one of them is physical and mental abuse. Well, if we look at the CRC, that means physical abuse, psychological violence, sexual abuse, sexual assault, and maltreatment, mistreatment, as well as neglect. So these are all covered by the physical and mental abuse. And in our last state report, we said that in practice, we have narrowed down the scope a little bit. That is, there should be long-term infliction of such violence. As a result, corporate punishment may not count in that category. And that is why in 2021, we have a new definition incorporating the spirit of the CRC so that the practitioners know that there's no such thing as long-time sustained practice. As long as there is an incident of corporal punishment, neglect, physical abuse, or mental abuse, they all count as instances of mental and physical abuse. And this time, as we amended the Child and Youth Act, we have fully incorporated the definitions of this abuse of the CRC into the newly amended Act. So you also talk about reporting. According to our law, yes, mandatory reporting is included, including provisions in the Child and Youth Act, Article 53, medical professionals, educators, and preschool teachers, judicial staff, and neighborhood leaders, social workers, in fulfilling their duties, come into contact with children and identify some signs of physical abuse or mental abuse or maltreatment. They have the obligation to report within 24 hours. And to whom? To the competent authorities, the local city, county government, within which there will be a social department that is in charge of these matters. So the reporting must be done within 24 hours after you become aware of this situation. If you fail to do so, you will be punished according to law. You will be fined for 6,000 to 60,000 NT. Therefore, mandatory reporting obligation is definitely in the law. In addition, members of the general public can also report cases of abuse. So aside from the people I just described who have the obligation, who have to do the mandatory reporting, anyone who spots the situation of abuse can report. And according to our law, the identity of the informant will be protected. So there's no need to worry about retaliation or intimidation. At the same time, the child in question, whose identity will be protected as well. If anyone, including the media or online sources, reveal the personal information of the child in the question, there will be penalties too. So how can people report cases of abuse? We have a help hotline, 113, which is on 24/7. We have dedicated staff to receive phone calls. Upon receiving the call, the staff will determine the location where the case happened, and the information will be referred to that particular city or county government. So we have one hotline, and the case will be transferred to local authority, where social workers will start to look into the situation. At the same time, the police, the hospitals will also be informed. You asked that in terms of the judicial involvement. Right now, we have 22 cities and counties, and there is a child protection safety net, including the police, prosecutors, social workers, or medical professionals. They are all members of the network, and they actually have a line chat group, an online texting app. They have a group there. When they learn about maltreatment of children, in that line group, they will discuss what to do next. Doctors in that line group will first perform triage of the child's injury or wounds. So the physician, after examination, will tell the social worker that it seems that the child has been abused at home. And then the police officer will then look into the situation of other children in the same family. As for the prosecutor, they will initiate a criminal investigation because this is a violence case. As for the social worker, they will provide protective measures, including placement, our security and safety plan. Therefore, we do have a comprehensive, concrete, enforceable network in place. As for sexual violence within home, within the family, according to our law, sexual violence is also considered as domestic violence, and therefore criminal code provisions apply, and the protective order under the civil code can also be obtained so that the perpetrator can be removed from the home first. Take the year 2021, for example. Throughout the year, 7,700 cases have been reported, and 63% of the victims are minors, and 13% happened in home. And in these sexual abuse cases, the victims being removed from home, 15% of such child victims are removed from home, while the 85% still at home and applied for a protective order from the court. And social workers also have proposed safety plans for the child. For example, they would use some criteria to assess whether the sexual violence is misunderstood in the home. Sometimes if you remove the perpetrator, it doesn't really help. Rather, the social worker can have family meetings with all family members. Maybe the family members have misconceptions about sexual violence, and then the social worker can formulate a safety plan for the child. And in practice, such families may have multiple problems, intimate relationship issues, or there may be emotional extortions, the perpetrator may not only inflict sexual violence on the child, but also on his or her partner. So the mother in the family is unable to protect herself, let alone her children in the family. In that case, it's not fit to have the children stay in the family. The social worker will also assess whether there are enough protective factors in the child's case. If not, then the civil code protective order will be obtained to keep the child at home and remove the perpetrator. So 85% of the time, it's the perpetrator that will be removed from home. So we do have the legal framework in place to allow the social worker to make plans flexibly. As for special protection measures, for example, if we keep the child in home, and then the medical resources, the prosecutors, the police officers can go to the child to conduct interviews. So we do have a so-called one-stop shop services. In other words, we try to prevent forcing the child victim, to go to the prosecutor's office, to the court or the police station to report what has happened. For example, when the child is at the hospital, the social worker will go to the hospital to gather evidence. At the same time, the prosecutor, the police officers will also go to the hospital when the examination is carried out, and necessary documentation will also be carried out in the hospital in a very child-friendly environment for all these actions to take place. Also, in the judicial system, the social worker will keep the child victim all along the way, will keep company all along the way, and the social worker will also hear out the child's ideas. For children under the age of 12, in the wake of sexual abuse, they sometimes may forget what happened. Or if you ask them the same question repeatedly, they may experience secondary victimization. Therefore, we do have a guideline to reduce repeated questioning and interviewing. So we do have the forensic interviewer in place to help the prosecutor to interview the child, making sure there's no guided questions, so that the evidence presented by the child will not be contaminated. As for the statutes of limitation, recently in Taiwan, we have experts and NGO representatives beginning to advocate for the amendment. I think the Judicial Yuan and the MOJ will be the competent authorities. I'm sure they will respond later. As for child abuse, well, we have spent a lot of time communicating with parents. We encourage parents to engage in affirmative, positive child rearing practice. They should avoid using negative disciplinary actions against their children. Throughout the nation, we have been promoting such positive parenting skills. As for traumatized child, at the hospital, the police, the social worker, the prosecutor, we are now promoting the so-called trauma-informed practice. We know that these children or their perpetrators may have been exposed to past trauma or abuse. So we hope all the stakeholders will be aware of the past trauma they may have experienced. So this is what the practitioners have been promoting.
And on reporting, as I mentioned, there's mandatory reporting. The report is made to the Bureau of Social Affairs at local government. And for psychological violence, it is forbidden by the law. Insulting, degrading, and so on are considered to be psychological violence. As long as evidence can be provided, it will be addressed as a form of violence. And I would stop here first. Thank you. Okay, how about the effectiveness of helping children returning home? When you get information on this, maybe you can provide it later. Okay, next, maybe MOJ, you can talk about investigation and statute of limitations. Dear ROC members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am from the Department of Prosecutorial Affairs from MOJ. I think my colleague from Ministry of Health and Welfare had provided a lot of details. Let me add by saying that early intervention for major child-related cases, and if in the hospital, the doctors and the nurses suspect that this is a significant child abuse case, then they will report the case, make the report to the local authorities, and the police procedures will be launched as well. The police then will report to the district prosecutor's office, and we have prosecutors who specialize in children and women's affairs, on sexual abuse or sexual assault cases. We have such dedicated prosecutors at each district prosecutors' offices, and they take shift day by day. So when the police officers are notified of such a case, they will report to the prosecutors will initiate the investigation, the prosecutors will contact the hospitals to gather evidence for one. I think that's the process of early intervention in significant child abuse case. It was asked that whether or not we can remove the perpetrator from the home. If the evidence is sufficient and all the elements are met, then we ask for detention of the perpetrator. So these suspect with a court order will be detained in the detention center in the court. Of course, the prerequisite is that there is enough evidence and that their offense is serious enough to be detained. And on reporting of sexual violence, again, for major cases, we have prosecutors on shift to initiate immediate investigation into major cases. And as mentioned by our colleague, we have the one-stop service model. Sometimes we need to double-check with the children for more details. In such a case, we have a conversation room in the prosecutor's office. It's different from the investigation court. Investigation court looks like just a normal court, but at every prosecutor's office now, there's at least 1 or 2 rooms that are more comfortable. So there is a bench which is taller. Usually in such rooms, prosecutors and the victims can sit at the same level. It looks like a living room. We may put some toys or stuffed animals in it so that when the person who is going to be interviewed is a child and he or she is tired, they can go ahead and play with the stuffed animals or the toys to relax a bit. So this is the design of these dedicated rooms. As for statute of limitations, well, there happen to be some cases that stir these conversations. So some legislators have proposed amendment to our law referring to some international laws. Our ministry is also discussing internally as to how to amend the law. Thank you. Thank you. Ministry of Education on witness children or children witness. Okay, for students who witness domestic violence, well, the domestic violence prevention centers in different cities taking the cases and issue a notification to the schools. The schools will launch meetings and ask the teachers of the students and the counselors to discuss this case specifically. There are several principles to abide by. First, confidentiality, so that this child will not be labeled or stigmatized and their privacy can be protected. Second principle, provide caring and loving environment for the children and help them to build positive relations with teachers and peers. Also, make sure that they attend schools on a regular basis. As for their psychological trauma, the school will evaluate how much counseling the child requires. After the school meeting, within 30 days, they have to report the results of their solutions back to the Domestic Violence Prevention Center. If this child is seriously traumatized and need more expertise, then they will transfer this case to a specialized center in order to provide professional counseling for the child. Okay, thank you. I think Professor Volkov also asked about a hotline will distribute. It's not will, it's has to.
And on the hotline, is that for reporting violence against children, or is it a hotline for everybody who needs help? So all kinds of issues can be reported, meaning that you have to have a staff with variety of qualifications and knowledge of certain problems. It's perhaps difficult, different if somebody reports on a traffic accident at which he lost one of the children or one of the parents. That's all what we can report it. Parents can report or on suicide and that kind of thing. Okay.
Thank you for your question. Let me respond to the question on the hotline 113. When it was created, it was considered to be a contact. It's one phone number with 3 services. What 3 services? First, child protection service. Second, domestic violence. And number 3, sexual assault. Now there are more services. For example, digital-based sexual violence. It is related to sexual or some issues related to children's rights or women's rights can also be reported. Some people call in not to report, but they need counseling. They don't know who to call, so they call 113 first. That's possible too. One of the questions was about helping children to return to the society or to be included back or integrate back to the society. Well, in a major child abuse case, if the social workers evaluate this family and find out that this family is not fit for the children, then this child requires protective placements. In protective placements, a process or a planning process will start to help the children to return to home one day. So the social workers will help address the trauma of the child, provide a stable life environment for the children, and also help the family to be improved. If the situation of family improves, then we talk to the children and the primary caregivers and the parents as well in order to launch a progressive process for the child to return home. For example, they can start by meeting each other on a regular basis, and the social workers will listen to the opinions of the child, and then one day the child may return home fully. However, in many cases, it is not possible for the child to return home. The family is so dysfunctional even after 1 year or 2 years counseling. In this kind of case, we need to provide long-term counseling plan for the child. The plan includes deep conversations with the child as to where they want to go next. Do they want to stay in the institution? Do they want to become independent, go back to the community, have their independent life? Or, considering their best interest of his or hers, they want to change their guardian through legal proceedings, or they want to be adopted by other families, that is to change their legal identity or status. After conversations with the child, if the child decided to go back to the community, then we help them become independent. This is a program. By then, the government needs to support them with their medical needs, their residential needs, education needs, careers, and adapt to their new life. All of these require a specialized help from the social workers. We did a research, and we know that with our efforts, many children, after they go through this program to regain their independence, they feel they are nourished. So they go to universities, study in social work, and become social workers. And then they return to the system to help other children as a way to pay back to the society. Thank you. The mic is not working.
I already announced that I'm going to punish this microphone. It's working. You gave an example of integration and how a victim ultimately was, let's say, quote unquote, successful in her life, in career, university, and so on and so forth. But let me elaborate on that example. That woman by now was sexually abused by a family member when she was 5. She has now completed university study, finally talks about that particular experience event 20 years ago. And now the question, because I need a clear answer on the statute of limitation. That woman goes to the police and reports that particular case, and the police tells her, well, that's very sorry, but we are not going to prosecute that because you had to be done that in 15 years after the offense was committed. So the question is, are you going to change your statute of limitation, or is there no limitation in reporting sexual abuse and other violence? And will it be prosecuted any time you report it as a victim? That's the question.
So I come from the Department of Prosecutorial Affairs, MOJ. So based on our knowledge, Taiwan recently has seen some cases, and our parliament is also proposing some amendments, drawing lessons from the German legislation. So within our ministry, we're also discussing this matter because this means we need to review all the laws involving sexual crime. So in the Sexual Exploitation Prevention for Children and Youth Act, as well as the Criminal Code, all laws and regulations touching upon sex crime will need to be reviewed. So we are working on it.
Okay. Are there further questions on violence? No further questions on violence. I was waiting for something to happen since we were supposed to have a break at 3 o'clock. Nothing happens. Let's have a break. I don't know why that was in the program. It was specifically mentioned there. But anyway, let's have a break of 15 minutes now. We start again at 3:30. 3:30. And then we continue with basic health or, oh, okay. With family environment and alternative care. Okay. 15 minutes. Get some coffee or relax anyway.
各位贵宾，我们本场次的审查会议，我们上半场到这边结束。依据刚刚主席说明的，我们这场的休息时间呢，调整为15分钟。稍后请各位在3点半的时候回到我们的会场。我们在会场外面备有咖啡和热茶，也欢迎各位享用。稍后我们在3点半的时候继续我们后续的会议。谢谢。
For the first few seconds, there will be no word. Two or 3 seconds.
You don't need to turn off the mic. You can just leave it on for the rest of the session. Yes. Yeah. So he will help you with all of these.
Don't bother.
Yeah. To make it. Yeah. Yeah. So. Always. Okay. Yeah, we will continue to make sure that it will be in session, and it will not be turned on.
I don't. There's nothing I have to do.
No, nothing you have to do. Just pick up and speak. Everything will be set.
Yeah. Okay.
谢谢谢谢。And there are desserts prepared. Yeah. Some refreshments at the room.
In the meeting room.
Yes. 有想到他可以一直开着。
对，刚刚这个开始前有监视他开始上面，对，突然他就给他一个牌子不要关。
也算。
然后文件我怕的是他等一下又去拿隔壁。
可以关键。
对。
也算。好好。
So, back in the room, I saw that you all had coffee and some nice thing to chew on. But we are now going to chew on more difficult issues in the context of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'll give the floor to Dr. Cantwell to introduce the questions on the chapter on family environment and alternative care. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to concentrate effectively on the issue of alternative care. As we say every time, thank you for all the information that we received in the report and in the responses to the list of issues, and for being here to answer our questions today. This morning, the representative of the Ministry of Health and Welfare mentioned that the guidelines for the alternative care of children were the reference base for reviewing legislation on this issue, and that, of course, is an excellent piece of news, and we welcome very much the attention to the principles set out in the guidelines when you are reviewing both legislation and policy in this area. One of the aspects, or one of the many aspects of the guidelines in relation to alternative care is the emphasis that is placed on family-based care options as opposed to residential care, without denying that residential care has a role to play. Nonetheless, the development of family-based alternative care is the main target, if you wish, of policy in this sphere. I would like, first of all, to understand better how you see the constraints or the obstacles, if you like, to enhancing the role of kinship care and foster care in Taiwan. I know that efforts have been made to, in particular in relation to foster care, in order to increase the number of foster families and to therefore make better use or more use of that option. But I also know that there are problems related to the development of this option, and I would like to know if you feel that the obstacles in place are more related to a lack of willingness in general to provide care as a kinship carer or a foster carer, or whether it is more related to, for example, financial or other support that is considered to be inadequate for kinship carers and or foster carers. So, in other words, if more financial support and perhaps more support in carrying out their duties in general, if that was made available, do you think that that would be the key issue to address, or is it a question of addressing attitudes towards that role in general, regardless of the financial and other support that might be made available? So that's my first question. The second is the issue of children with disabilities, or alternative care for children with disabilities. Again, we talked of this 5 years ago, but it seems that from information available that children with disabilities still find it difficult to access family-based care, including domestic adoption, and that very much so. I mean, the proportion apparently of children with disabilities among domestic adoptees is extraordinarily small, and of course is the majority of children being placed with foreign adoptive parents. So within Taiwan, what further efforts have been made and could be made in relation to finding family-based alternative care for children with disabilities? Thirdly, I'd like to understand better the approach in Taiwan to small group homes. On a general level, let's say on a global level, small group homes are preferred to larger residential facilities. So when you're looking for an alternative care option for a child, you first look obviously at family-based care, the possibilities for family-based care, be it kinship care or foster care, and then you look at if neither of those are either available or suitable for that particular child, you then look for a small residential setting which may be as close to a family-like atmosphere as possible, and then if that is not available or suitable for the particular child, you may look then at the possibilities of larger residential facilities. The exception would be that if a child or that there may be small group homes dealing with specific issues, for example, children with disabilities, that not necessarily the best solution, but nonetheless looking at small small group homes that focus on children with specific needs, but that's the exception. The rule is that, well, the general policy is to look first at small group homes before looking at larger residential facilities. In Taiwan, it seems that it's the reverse, that you look first at placement in a larger facility, and then if you decide that the child is not suitable for being cared for in a larger facility, then you look at placement in a small group home. And this is quite a surprising, I mean, it may well have a very logical base, but it's quite a surprising solution for someone such as I, who looks at alternative care worldwide. So I'd really like to understand better, or understand completely, what's behind this approach. Why small group homes seem to be the ultimate option, as opposed to being an option prior to looking at larger facilities. My next question concerns the private sector, the role of the private sector in providing residential care. It was extremely interesting this morning, again, a representative of the Ministry of Health and Welfare who mentioned the problem of the best interests of the child being jeopardized when facilities were private facilities were fundraising and using children to give performances in order to fundraise for that particular facility, and that is kind of symptomatic of some of the problems that can arise. But my focus is particularly on the fact that the great majority of residential facilities in Taiwan, as far as I can understand, are privately run, and that the only facilities in Taiwan that receive poor evaluation reports, I think it's categories C and D in your system, that only private facilities are represented amongst those that receive very poor evaluation reports. Now, if that's the case, and it seems that the statistics show that, this is, of course, extremely concerning. Why would this be, and what can we do about it? So the question would be precisely, what is the cause of this fact, and what is the cause of the fact that the government-run facilities seem to all receive grade A excellent evaluation reports? Is this because the government is monitoring its own institutions and giving them good grades, or is it really that the private institutions are providing poor services? If it's a question of the private facilities providing, or some, and not an inconsequential number of private facilities providing poor services, to what extent is this an issue of
poor licensing regulations or standards? To what extent is it a problem of inadequate monitoring during the facility's operation? To what extent is it, might it be due to resources made available? The issue of resources has been brought up a number of times in other information provided to the review committee, and it seems, and I believe this was the case also 5 years ago, if my memory is correct, that private facilities receive approximately 50% of the cost of caring for a child from the government, and they find their the other 50% themselves. Now, I don't know how they do that, whether it's through fundraising efforts that may in part depend on child performances, etc. But the problem is, obviously, that if the government is providing 50% of the funding, and yet it is the government's obligation to quote Article 20 to ensure alternative care for children who cannot be looked after by their family, then the consequences of giving only or providing only 50% of the cost of caring are considerable and numerous. And one of them may be, obviously, that if the facility itself cannot, does not manage to raise sufficient funds over a given year, even if it's a trough, if it's a temporary a blip in the landscape, but it probably won't be, then what happens? Does the quality of care provided by that facility automatically drop? Do the numbers that facility can look after drop? What are the consequences of that system? And also, what are the consequences in terms of the quality of the staff that can be recruited because of limited financial resources, and what about their retention? I mean, one of the major, this is not a Taiwanese problem, it's a worldwide problem. One of the major obstacles to the provision of quality care in a residential setting in particular is that qualified staff cannot be retained because they are working under both financial and conditions and just general working conditions that are just too unfavorable, and they are unable to make ends meet or to feel satisfied with the work that they are able to carry out. Very often because their numbers are insufficient to provide the kind of service that they would like to provide to the children in their care. So those are my questions in relation to the private sector and the government's implication in care provided by the private sector. I mean, these are my additional questions. I think the concern already about the evaluation, the licensing and evaluation of the numerous private facilities, that's pretty much established, but I had those specific questions in addition. my final question on alternative care as such is the question, the thorny question of deinstitutionalization. It's quite clear that the majority, the large majority of children in alternative care are being looked after in residential facilities, and I haven't visited a residential facility, and I wish I had before coming back into this review committee. I haven't visited a residential facility in Taiwan. So I am depending on information provided to the committee by various sources, hopefully credible, and so I don't know to what extent these facilities would fall under the term institution, because we don't use institution as an equivalent of residential care. Residential care includes institutions, large, let's say, impersonal facilities. And of course, residential care can take other forms, such as precisely small group homes. So, in terms of the need for deinstitutionalization, of the system of alternative care, I'm not sure to what extent it exists. I mean, it obviously exists, and from the information that we receive, it looks as though the system is, the residential care system is largely institutional in nature. So on the hypothesis that deinstitutionalization would be an appropriate path to follow in alternative care policy, I note that there is, I think, some hesitation to develop a fully fledged deinstitutionalization strategy in Taiwan. That may well be understandable for different reasons, historical and other, but I definitely get the feeling that that there is a hesitation, that there is not a conviction. There is no conviction in Taiwan that deinstitutionalization is a necessary process to go through in terms of alternative care provision. So I'd very much like to hear the responsible authorities on that issue. Are they convinced that this would be a good path to go down? Do they have questions about it? Perfectly valid. But do they have questions about it? What are those questions, if so? And what otherwise is holding up the development of a full, targeted, tailored to Taiwan, tailored to its realities? What are the obstacles to the development of such a strategy to deinstitutionalize the alternative care system? So that is what are the additional questions that I wanted to pose on alternative care, and I just wanted to make a couple of remarks on adoption. I'm not going to ask more questions on inter-country adoption, because we did deal with that to a considerable degree in 2017. I will mention nonetheless that I was quite intrigued that the Netherlands, having gone through a process of suspending all inter-country adoptions because of concerns about the adoption process from countries of origin in general, have just decided to restart inter-country adoptions from 6 countries, one of which is Taiwan. This is quite. This is all the more intriguing in that, of course, Taiwan cannot be a party to the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption, and for most receiving countries now, that is the basic criterion. If you're not a party to the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption, you don't have your children adopted in a country that is a party. And since the Netherlands has gone through this major overhaul, if you like, of its inter-country adoption program, the fact that Taiwan has come out among the six countries for which from which inter-country adoption can take place to the Netherlands is quite significant. So that's part of the reason that I'm not going to ask for further information on inter-country adoption as such. But I do want to take up again the issue of domestic adoption, and in particular, once again to ask the concerned authorities what they feel is the future of domestic adoption in Taiwan, in particular, but not only for children with disabilities. Again, Taiwan is by no means alone in the world as being a country for whom the need to find adoptive families abroad for children with disabilities seems to be ongoing, but the concern is always that the best interests of the child might be better served by enabling that child to remain in his or her culture and not have to be moved halfway across the world in order to find the protection that he or she needs and to which he or she has the right. So the concerns.
所以我们所关切的
There seems to be little encouragement of domestic adoption in Taiwan, that the promotion of domestic adoption as a solution for children with disabilities does not seem to be bearing fruit if it's taking place. And one of the worries expressed to us is the lack of support for domestic adopters who may wish, in particular, to, or who may be willing, in particular, to care for a child with disabilities.
So is there effectively a push on the part of the government to develop further domestic adoption of children in general and children with special needs, children with disabilities in particular? Thank you. I think the questions were clear, even if the presentation was quite long. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your responses.
You have the floor, sir. Thank you, Nigel, for all the questions, very important questions, and needs clear answers, and I hope they will get that. Sir, you have the floor.
First of all, on behalf of the Executive Yuan, I will address the issue of deinstitutionalization and some relevant ideas proposed by Nigel. I agree with what you said, and we are definitely working toward that direction. On deinstitutionalization, when we deal with people with disabilities, the elderly population, people with mental disorders, we are working on deinstitutionalization. Secondly, I think kinship care should take precedence. When it's not available, we move on to group home. And then, if that's not available either, we move on to residential facilities. And this three-staged approach is something we agree with completely, and we are working on that too. But we have to admit there are difficulties. For example, residential care traditionally was provided for children with disabilities by foreign missionaries in Taiwan, and they provide such institutional care for children with special needs. We have been inspired by the examples they set, and the quality of care they provided was also exemplary. So these are lessons we can draw from our history. As a result, many private institutions try to emulate that. And is it because of this that we are not so motivated to promote kinship care and foster care? We are not sure if the linkage is there, but we are aware that it's necessary to promote and encourage more kinship care and group homes. These new types of alternative care should be widely encouraged. More resources should be made available to them as well, so that we can be in line with the international trend or best practices globally. So policy-wise, yes, we agree with your proposal. As for the practice, I will ask the Ministry of Health and Welfare to respond.
Alternative care. I think you know that we have a policy for the alternative care of children in Taiwan. Because according to the concluding observation on the initial national report, the reviewing committee recommends that the government should review the situation of current alternative care and allocate resources in providing the most appropriate placement of children in need of alternative care and in conformity with the UN guideline. Therefore, in 2019, the government has established a task force with representatives from local government, academics, NGOs, and the practice experts. And after multiple discussion and consultation, the policy for the alternative care of children in Taiwan
was finally accomplished in 2021 and approved by Executive Yuan's Child Welfare and Right Promotion Group at the end of the year. And the policy has also gotten funding more than 2.2 billion from the programs of strengthening the social safety net phase 2 during the year of 2022 to 2025. So I would very much appreciate if I can answer your question in the context with our policy of alternative care. And before we drafting the policy, we have reviewed the current situation and the policy, and we find that over half of the children in the out-of-home care seat were under institutional care. And the reasons are because of lack of supportive services for kinship care. The number of the children in out-of-home care, and I will abbreviate it as OOHC afterwards. The number of the children in OOHC enter into kinship care was still low. In addition to the insufficient funds for placement, it was hard to find a suitable relative to cater for the child. The factor influencing the willing of relatives included limited assistance, unfamiliarity with the role of caregiver, or the lack of ability to care for children, and insufficient supports, and the interference with family life. And the most important is the decline in their energy with aging. Now, most of kinship caregiver was older, not well educated, and in poor financial conditions. So, though kinship care should take precedence over other placement options, the proportions of OOHC is still the lowest. And the second reason is the lack of capacity in foster care. And the decrease of foster family could be attributed to the challenges of care difficulties. On the one hand, over 30% of the children in foster care were with abnormal health conditions such as disease, injuries, disabilities, or behavioral problems. But on the other hand, foster parents were relatively older. Nearly 80% of foster fathers and 17% of foster mothers were over the age of 15. And moreover, the foster care placement fees were insufficient to meet the needs of children's living and development. Comprehensive support services were still needed to sustain existing foster families and to recruit new ones. In terms of a group home now was not yet a statutory form of care. So that's why from the Act, the priorities is not before the residential care. And the central government, the SFAA, has started to push for group home pilot plan for OOHC children with special needs since 2010, and which has subsidized the NGOs to set up group homes for children with special needs or multiple placements. However, because group home was not a statutory form of care and the operational cost was too high, local governments were not willing to allocate funds for developing group homes. In addition, the difficulties that hindered NGOs from establishing group homes included take care of children with special needs, lack of access to the professional resources, or proper premises for group home, and high turnover rate of frontline caregivers. Moreover, although group homes could provide family-like care, the placements were extremely limited. As a result, most of the children in OOHC were placed in residential institutions. And to this issue, we have set a goal. Our goal is the precedence must be given to the development and expansion of family-based alternative care. And the institutional care must be reviewed and adjusted to meet the needs of children in OOHC. Fourth, the precedence must be given to the development and expansion of family-based alternative care. Our strategic and action plan is to support kinship caregiver for providing stable and safe care. We will formulating work guidelines for local governments, and we will give the kinship caregiver the placement fee. That means the kinship caregivers could get fees like foster families if they care those children. And we also providing systematic education and training for kinship caregivers to strengthen their care knowledge and skills, and delivering accessible service by regular in-home guidance and consultation according to their needs. And we also establish supportive groups for kinship caregivers to build peer support and enhancing problem-solving skills through the exchange of experiences. And as to expand the service capacity of the foster care, we are revising the work benchmark for foster care services, including the lift of restriction on the age of 65 for foster parents, the recruitment of certificated child care providers as foster caregivers, and additional professional allowances given to such caregivers. And the central government also require local governments to amend their regulations for foster care in conformity with the above-mentioned measures. And we also encourage reserve foster families to offer respite services for the foster parents with the OOHC child, so that they could have a chance to take a rest and ease their burden of care. And this respite service could also be provided to those vulnerable children and their families, especially for those who just returned home from OOHC, to support the parents to be able to better care for children gradually. And we also providing timely support services to new foster parents and implementing solutions to enhance their family members' recognition of foster care. Thus, the retention rate of the foster families is able to be kept. And the government also developing pluralistic support solutions for foster care and strengthening training for foster parents willing to take care of children with special needs. And besides, we also encourage local governments to set up group homes. And we will amending the Protection of Child and Youth Welfare and the Right Act and the enforcement rules of the PCYWRA to bring the group home resources into the forms of statutory care and formulating standards for the setup of group home while taking the operational flexibility and diversity into account. And we will assisting local governments in expanding the number of group homes in collaboration with NGOs, where local governments should provide social housing resources for NGOs to set up group home. The group home should focus on building the family-like attachment and emotional supports between children and the caregivers. While the service model may be developed with flexibility and diversity depending on the special needs of the children in OOHC. Accordingly, in order to enable the development of group home, the manpower of caregivers could cover professionals and non-professionals, and the non-professionals who are probably the members of other family, such as couples, sisters, or relatives. And these non-professionals could be trained as qualified caregivers after successfully completing certain training courses. And local governments should conduct periodic visitation and guidance for group homes and connect the necessary resources depending on the needs of the children in OOHC. Besides, I want to clarify your questions about the alternative care option. Actually, in accordance with the provision of Article 10 of the enforcement rules of PCYWRA, when placed children, the local government should abide by the following order. The first one is the proper relatives, the kinship care. And the second is the significant others of the child who have a long-term positive and stable attachment with the child. And the third is the foster care qualified by authorized agencies. And fourth is the placement institutions permitted by competent authorities. So placement institutions is the last resort. And if the group home becomes a statutory forms of care, and the priority will be for the placement institution. Okay, then about the excuse me, I means if the group home becomes the statutory forms of care, the priority of group home will be for placement institutions. Thank you. And 我想我还没答完。
I'm not done.
The private institution. Could I take a little rest? Let the adoption to answer first. Thank you so much.
在等待的期间，我先回应一下那个收。
Okay, I'll respond to the question on adoption. Yes, when it comes to adopting children with disabilities, it's very challenging. In the Taiwanese society, we try to promote and encourage Taiwanese people to take care of children with special needs so that there will be a higher percentage of adoption. For these adoption families, we provide family support services. Of course, they will need respite services, subsidies, or other services. We are promoting these services. In the future, in our law, we will try to strengthen the provision of such services. There are also evaluation criteria and matching agencies, which are usually NGOs. We strengthen the matching services. We require the matching agencies to try to increase adoption rates for children with disabilities. Of course, ideally, children should be able to stay in their original family. If they need financial needs and require supports, we want to help the families so that they can keep the children, so that they will not put the children up for adoption. When it comes to all the adoption policies, we want to provide immediate support to the families so that they can keep the children, and only when the families become really dysfunctional, will we consider alternative care. That's our national policy.
Why the private placement institutions get the worst grade of evaluation? I think the reasons are because their placement resources failed to meet the diverse needs of children. It was hard for the children with special needs to adapt to the residential care of institutions, especially for ones with physical or mental disabilities. And the second reason is the child-to-self ratio standards of placement institutions failed to meet the practical needs. But that's because it's according to the article, the regulation of the standards for establishing children welfare institutes. Placement institutions have to meet the requirement for child-to-staff ratios. For children with special needs, the child-to-caregiver ratio is 4:1. But actually, in practice, the average of child-to-caregiver ratio was 2:1. And the lower ratio also reflected the challenges facing frontline workers of placement institutions. And the third reason is the local government's placement fees fail to reflect the carrying cost. And because the fees because the fees could only meet the needs of children's living and would not be sufficient to cover the personnel and operating costs of the private placement institutions. And the periodical review and rolling adjustment of individual care plan for children in the placement institution was not fully implemented. And the current oversight mechanism varied in degree and failed to ensure the service quality. And therefore, we have a goal that the institution care must be reviewed and adjusted to meet the needs to meet the needs of children in OHC. And the strategical and action plans. The first is we will reinforce the expertise of the institutional caregivers and the supportive resources for them. And we will adjust the scale of placement institutions and enhance the service qualities. In the future, we will amend the standards for establishing children welfare institutions to regulate the maximum number of approved places to accommodate children for a placement institution, and leading the institution to provide care in a setting as close as possible to a family or small group situation. And for placement institutions whose numbers of children accommodated less than the numbers of approved places by the competent authorities, the central government will urge the local government to guide the institutions to decrease the number of approved places so as to vitalize the space released and enrich facilities and equipment to meet the needs for the care of the children. And now we are developing short-term residential therapeutic programs.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why?
Question, as far as I understood, Dr. Cantwell, private institutions get much less financial support from the government than the state institutions. Is that a correct assumption? That's the question.
Right.
The question is, why are you paying governmental institutions much more than private? Because is there a reason you want to get them closed? Well, I'm just guessing whether there is a reason to give them less money.
Actually, most private institutions are affiliated to foundation. And they can raise money from the public. But it's not the reason. But I think they don't think it's a reason that government should give them less resources.
Well, that's an opinion. The fact is,
yes,
as much as the institutions that the government. Okay, 50% off. So the answer is yes, they get less than governmental institutions. Now the next question, the kind of natural next question, why is that? And that they are linked to foundations doesn't seem to be a very convincing argument because they are depending on charity foundations, and the children in the private institutions should have the same quality of care as in governmental institutions, and money should not be a reason to give those children in private institutions less service. and support. Anyway, the answer is clear, but I don't know yet why. Because the answer, they are linked to a foundation. The governmental institutions are linked to a very powerful foundation, and that's the government of Taiwan.
Well, in fact, private institutions can also get funding for placement from local governments. And the central government also subsidizes these private institutions for their manpower. And if they organize some activities, we also pay for their counseling services of the children under their care. They can apply for funding and grants from the central government. But not all private institutions would file for grants from us. So I think the chair's question is, if a child is placed in a public institution, another in a private institution, the resources provided by the government should be the same. Otherwise, there's the problem of inequality according to the CRC. I think that's the gist of the question. Well, allow me to explain. No matter it's a private or a public institution, the support from the government or subsidies for the child is the same. Of course, these institutions may say, I need to raise funds, or the foundation can provide more resources. Basically, that's the internal management and operation of that foundation. For government part, the central or local governments will provide the same amount of resources for private as well as public institutions.
Very tired by the end of the day. However, believe me, I just want one specificity in relation to what you said. You were talking about the staff-to-child ratio in residential facilities, and I want to see if I understood that. In particular, in relation to children with disabilities, in a residential facility, the staff-to-child ratio that is required is 1:4, and in practice it is 1:2. It is twice as high.
对，实务上是
twice as good as.
对，因为
Exactly, that is correct, because we would exactly, that is correct, because at the institutions we hire more caregivers, because these caregivers have to take shifts. They work in shifts. So for public and private institutions, they do hire more caregivers to make sure there's sufficient manpower to work in different shifts. As a result, the staff-to-child ratio is 1:2, because we use the total number of caregivers to do the calculation.
I think we are satisfied with all the answers to the many questions that were raised in the context of family environment and in particular alternative care. Thank you very much for your tireless efforts to answer the questions. And we are at the last chapter, and that is on disabilities and basic health care. And the floor is for Dr. Toby.
Thank you so much for your extraordinary insights into what are very complex issues. The time is now 4:40, and I think we're supposed to end at 5 o'clock.
Yep.
So I imagine you're all exhausted. What I will try and do is be very concise in my questions, and perhaps if we can't answer them today, we can respond perhaps tomorrow morning, because I'm conscious we've asked you to listen and talk for a long period of time. So I will start then quickly with the issue of children with a disability. A few quick observations. The materials indicate to us that there are several gaps in issues concerning access to things like parks and recreation, participation in sporting events, access to services, issues around inclusive education, and concerns around shortages of staff. We understand, though, that there is clearly a plan in place within the government to try and address these issues. A few quick questions then. First, I've just been given the National Human Rights Action Plan. Can I commend you on this document? I think it's extraordinary. I will take it back to my own country and tell my government that they should be doing what you are doing. So that is an endorsement of your commitment to human rights across the field. It's very impressive. But one observation is that when it comes to issues around people with disabilities, on page 77 onwards, there are some identified priority areas, but there is no mention of children. I highlight that because there is often a risk that in human rights plans, we tend to forget about marginalised groups. Not to say that's happened here, but I just want to flag that. The second point then is a question for you. In terms of that plan you have, how will you go about incorporating the views of children with disability into your action plan? It's a very difficult area to undertake, but it's essential if we are to adopt a genuine rights-based approach to addressing these issues. The second observation is that I note in the action plans that are identified, children are actually not mentioned specifically. Again, that may be because there's a separate plan, but I just want to identify that as an issue of concern. The third point and a question is, all of this will take an allocation of significant resources. So my question is, has the government committed those resources to ensure and realise this action plan for all people with disability, but in our case, particularly children with a disability? And my colleague, Professor Lundy, will talk tomorrow about specific issues concerning issues around access to education for children with disability. So that's my first set of questions. Second set of questions relates to the issue of COVID-19. A very discrete question. Is there any commitment to undertaking a review as to the impact of COVID-19 on children and the government's response to the pandemic to ensure that if and sadly when another pandemic arises, we have learnt lessons about how best to minimise the impact on children and minimise, obviously, the rates of infection? So that's really a question about reviewing impact of COVID-19. Third question is the broader question of healthcare services. I note again that healthcare is not identified in the National Human Rights Action Plan, so I'm curious to know why that is the case. There is presumably a good explanation, but we've noticed in the materials there are gaps, again, in issues around access to healthcare services, particularly in rural communities, amongst Indigenous students, people with children with disabilities, and particularly in the area of mental health. So it's just a question mark about why it wasn't included. The second point, clearly you have a very advanced and developed healthcare system. There are gaps. So other question goes in, is there a commitment by the government to allocate the necessary resources to address those gaps over time? Then some specific issues relating to children's health. Number one concerns mental health. I raise this because in my own country, we neglected mental health of young people for a long time, and that had serious impacts on them, including a high suicide rate. We have now recognised that was not the most appropriate measure, and we have dedicated significant resources to try and address that deficit. our sense in reading the materials is that you have mental health services, but they aren't always sufficient to address the needs of children. And so some of the data talks about, for example, children who have harmed themselves, in some cases only 1/3 having access to counselling. So my question is, what measures are being done to review and ensure the progressive implementation of an effective mental health service that is appropriate for young people? Bearing in mind that is not a short-term plan, it will take time, but it's obviously essential. That is then linked to the issue of suicide, which still remains too high. I think we would all agree. I notice that the Human Rights Action Plan says on page 18 that this issue will be prioritised. My question is how, and again, is there a commitment to allocate adequate resources, financial, research personnel, to ensure we fully understand the reasons why children are taking their lives and presumably also causing self-harm short of taking their lives in many circumstances? So how can we help them? 3 last questions which are more discreet. The issue of obesity still remains at around 30%, far better than my own country where it's 45 to 50%, but it's still presumably too high. I note there was a pilot undertaken to try and reduce obesity. My question for you is, will there be an attempt to obviously expand the findings from this pilot to provide greater measures to address childhood obesity and overweightness in the years to come? The last 2 questions, one concerns issues of trans youth, so children seeking to transition or affirm their identity from male to female or female to male. I notice in the National Human Rights Action Plan at page 92 that there is a commitment to support transgender people, but there's no mention of trans youth. So I'm curious to know whether there's an awareness of the discrete needs of young people seeking to undertake transgender medical services. Not necessarily surgical intervention, but certainly having access to things like puberty blockers or hormone treatment prior to turning 18. Last question is around the issue of access to an abortion. And I note again in the materials it suggests that certainly young girls can have access to an abortion, but it appeared on my reading that that was only when there was parental consent. I want to clarify whether in fact a young girl who is medically competent can decide to terminate her pregnancy on her own volition in circumstances where perhaps a parent or some other person, a guardian, if they're in care, has a different view about what that child should be doing as well. That's, I think, is sufficient for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, you have the floor.
Please be concise in your responses so that we can get off the class on time. MOE. This is MOE on why National Human Rights Action Plan doesn't touch upon a lot on children with disabilities. When certain action plan was devised, I think there was comprehensive consideration for children. There is some planning for people with disabilities. There is some planning. Maybe when it comes to education for children with disabilities, it is not touched upon because our ministry is trying to amend the Special Education Act. We're trying to devising plans for inclusive education under CRPD, and that's why this national action plan doesn't really touch upon it. And I think we can provide you with information on the amendment to Special Education Act and on inclusive education if needed. Next, COVID-19 and its impact on children. Some preventive measures make it impossible for children to go to school. it leads to some challenge learning and care for children. We provide some support for online learning, hardware, software, and SIM card, and digital learning guidance, and so on are provided to students. Due to COVID-19, some students are emotionally unstable. So we create a remote counseling guidance so that counselors in schools can rely on this guidance and provide counseling in a more flexible way during COVID-19. Next, on suicide among children, yes, there are many factors. It's a very complicated issue. The cause include mental illness, family factor, a pressure from academic performance, and so on. In Taiwan, MOE and MOHW integrate their resources in order to provide counseling in preventing suicide. We manned the work plan, a 3-year work plan to prevent suicide. We integrate it with life education in order to increase protective factors and reduce suicide rate. As for obesity, at the different levels of education, we provide physical checkup for students to follow up with their physical height or weight so that they don't become obese. Schools have health promotion plans as well to help children to have reasonable height and weight, to provide them with more physical activities so that obese students can, through exercise, lower their weight. Thank you. Next, I think MOHW will be responsible for the several questions on health. Excuse me, this is Department of Mental Health. I want to briefly talk about mental health. MOE has said that there are some preventive measures for suicide. So we work with MOE on this regard. As for psychological supports, we continue to input more resources. You ask about how we can ensure that children know how to access the resources and if we have enough resources. Well, we have a 1952 hotline students can call. And starting from this year, we hope that we can add the online services. Students can use text to communicate with us. We want to have more psychological health centers. We think there should be one psychological center for a certain portion of the population so that this center is more accessible. We hope the local government can create more locations to provide quality mental health services. There are 381 these kind of centers. We want the Bureau of Health to work with schools so that the resources can be linked and they can take stock of the psychological and educational resources. The resources are made available to educational institutions. And maybe you ask about whether we analyze the causes of suicide. We collect the reports, the data, and we perform demographic analysis on the ways of suicide, the causes of suicide. We are also now trying to link different systems. For example, the MOE system on dropout students, so that we have a better understanding of the reasons or the risk factors for children's suicide. These are all the missions that are ongoing. This is from Health Administration. I want to respond to 2 of your questions. The first question is preventing obesity. In 2018, the Health Promotion Administration launched a strategy to fight against obesity. There are ways such as exercise, diet, and change of literacy. In 2021, we issue a manual guidance for schools and clinics and hospitals in order to prevent children obesity. As the MOE said, Health Promotion Administration and MOE started our program very early from elementary school. We, through checkups, follow up with the height and weight of the children. I think schools regard this as a very important part of their work. And MOE mentioned exercise, diet. Yes, these are our focus as well. So that schools provide healthy meals and forbid drinks with a lot of sugar from entering the schools. You also asked about abortion. According to the Hygienic Act, if minors need abortions, yes, their statutory agents need to give consent to the abortion. According to Genetic Health Act, that's the requirement. But in order to protect the right to health, we are discussing how we can amend the law so that during pregnancy or during abortion, teenagers and young people will have more rights to their own health. Thank you. Okay, the next question on medical resources or the lack of medical resources in rural area. Thank you for your question. This is National Health Administration. Why medical services are not included in Human Rights Action Plan? Well, the main reason is that universal health is a regular system in Taiwan already. So in rural areas for indigenous or children population, the universal health will have more and more plans. We will also change the reimbursement rules so that it favors children or indigenous communication. They have less resources indeed. So through programs, we want to inject more resources. For example, the doctors can go for, they can go on a tour, touring different areas so that medical services can still be delivered in rural areas. Thank you, Department of Social Work. I want to respond to the question on COVID-19 and the support we provide to children. I want to talk about how we provide economic support to family and children. Due to COVID-19, we're concerned that some economically vulnerable families are gravely impacted, so we encourage local government to provide food bank services. Social workers and resources are dedicated to people who need them. In Taiwan, there are 236 food warehouses or locations where vulnerable families can get food with vouchers. We also have a hotline, 1957. This is a counseling hotline, and people can call to understand how they can be supported if they need economic support or other support during the pandemic. And if families really need help, we can include them in the social safety net too. And quarantine and preventive measures for COVID-19 have been in place. Then if adults are not able to go to work because they have to guarantee they are not paid, we subsidize them with 1,000 NT dollars every day. So if this family has elementary school students or or children in high school whose caregivers are people with disabilities, then we provide such subsidies as well. Okay, next question on transgender teenagers or transgender young people. Who's going to respond to that question? Anyone? Well, if this agency is not here, maybe later on you can provide written information to the committee. How's that? Okay.
Well, Dr. Tobin just told me that he is really impressed by your answers. And that means that he gives up to ask more questions. And also, we are on time. And I think I can close this day of a rather intense process of questions and answers, and we got a lot of answers and very concise sometimes, but also very elaborated, and we have a lot of additional information that we will certainly take into account when we are going to draft the concluding observations. So thank you very, very much for all your input today and all your efforts to give clear answers and efforts that have been successful. And we will resume our meeting tomorrow at 9 o'clock for the chapters 8, 9, and 10. Those are the last three, and we hope that we can complete that round of questions and answers by noon tomorrow. And for that, we need your efforts as well, and we will try to be moderate in our questions. So, thank you very much again. Have a good evening. Enjoy and relax, and be back tomorrow in optimal shape and well rested. Okay, thank you very much.
谢谢各位贵宾。那我们今天的会议呢，就到这边结束。离场前呢，请。
This is the end of today's session. Before you leave, please take your belongings and return the headsets. Also to remind you that national reports, attachments are provided on the desk. Feel free to take a copy. If you need to submit extra information to the RSC, please upload it to the cloud storage of the Secretariat by tomorrow noon. Thank you very much. We'll start at 9 a.m. in the morning. See you tomorrow.
辛苦了，只能掌握60%。安尼就是，安尼就是。